I read a story recently about a fellow named Bob who went camping out in the mountains of the West and was really enjoying himself. He was walking very high up in the mountains and right next to a cliff where there's a drop of several hundred feet. And unfortunately, he got too close to the edge and he fell off the cliff and slipped down. He was falling down surely to his death. When fortunately he was able to grab onto a branch that was hanging off the cliff and just held on there for dear life. And he looked down, there was still a few hundred feet to the bottom. He thought, if I fall, this is the end of me. So he started yelling, help, anyone, please help me, save me. And in just a second, there's this voice come out and says, I will help you. And he looked around at anyone, he said, who is it? He says, it's the Lord, your God. He says, Bob says, thank you, God. Thank you for saving me. If you save me, I will do anything. I will go to church every week. I will be very good. I will start giving more to the church. And God replied, so, well, let's don't worry about that right now. Let's talk about that later on. But right now, I want to rescue you. So here's what I want you to do. Listen carefully. And Bob listened, and God said, first thing I want you to do is let go of that branch. And it was silent for a while, and finally Bob, after being silent for several minutes, started yelling out, anyone else, help me, anyone else out there, please, someone else help me. Well, unfortunately, that's sort of where it is. We want God's help, but we don't want to trust God. And I want to welcome everyone today. This is one of our videos. We are in Lent, and believe it or not, it is in March the 12th in Georgia, and yes, that snow behind me, you can see it's, we had some snow last night, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and even though we were in Georgia, this is the way it is, but it's kind of a good time for that's for our folks who are joining us on Facebook or YouTube to explain where we are, so welcome everyone. I said this is Lent, the time that we Christians are supposed to use discipline and self-denial to bring ourselves closer to God. And we studied last week about the temptation of Christ, which is in 3 of the Gospels. It's a short version of Mark, but in both Matthew and Luke, in chapter 6, ironically, in both of them, you have this temptation story where Satan comes to Jesus, after he's been baptized and has been led by the Spirit out into the wilderness for 40 days, and Satan comes and gives him 3 different temptations. I've always believed that Jesus really had it kind of easy during these temptations because Satan is, very blatant about that. He comes to him and wants him to worship him and all that. My experience is, and probably yours, is that the temptation, whether it's Satan or we call it our dark part of us or the evil inside of us or whatever you want to call it, where our temptations come from, is a lot of times usually more subtle. And instead of big things where we're drawn off and have these huge choices, it's many things during every day that we are tempted. In fact, temptation is so common in our culture that we make jokes about it. Mae West, everybody's heard of, made the statement, says, I generally avoid temptation unless I can't resist it. There was another speaker named Franklin Jones. He says, nothing makes it easier to resist temptation than a proper upbringing, a sound set of values, and witnesses. And that's probably true. He also said, lead me not into temptation. I'll find it myself. I will break off for a second from my lesson about that part about lead me not into temptation. That is part of the Lord's Prayer, at least in English. That is not really a good translation of that because why would God lead us into temptation? Why would we have to ask God not to do that? Well, a more appropriate interpretation of that, at least according to me, including Pope Francis, is do not abandon us into temptation. So think about that, and we'll make that a lesson for another day. But I believe that during Lent, we're often tempted, and while we're concentrated, a lot of times during Lent, people say, I'm going to give up Facebook, I'm going to give up chocolate, and that's a very good thing to do. But we're tempted to give up something that's not really what is keeping us from God. It sort of trivializes Lent a little bit. Instead of, we focus on the effects of temptation, the actions we do, instead of focusing on the causes of sin. That the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer is very blatant about the causes about sin. It teaches us in this catechism that sin is seeking our own will instead of God's. Let me repeat that. It says, sin is seeking our own will instead of God's will. It doesn't say anything about actions or bad habits or activities or whatever, but it says no, just seeking the will. Well, the Book of Common Prayer also teaches us that sin is when we are apart from God. And we are apart from God because we rebel against God and put ourselves in the place of God. And that's pretty blatant. We are all guilty of that, not wanting to follow God's will, but follow our own will. So often during Lent, we focus on actions that are the result of temptation, the result of sin, when God and the church calls us to focus on the cause of those actions, which is seeking our own will instead of God's will. Now, one thing for us to consider in Lent is about the story of Jesus' temptation, is that Jesus was confronted by Satan after the 40 days in the wilderness, after he'd been fasting for 40 days. Jesus was not confronted by him after the baptism and after he first goes up there, and because Jesus obviously studied the Torah because he was able to quote the Hebrew Bible to Satan very much. But the baptism and studying the Torah that Jesus had done were not intended to be sufficient for confronting with Satan and confronting these temptations. But Jesus spent those 40 days aligning himself to God's will. He was preparing his ministry by aligning himself to not Jesus' will, but God's will be done. So God calls us to trust him and to seek his will and not ours. And that is what the 40 days of Lent are for. So for that, we could say, thanks be to God.